What I'll be doing in this lecture and in the next two lectures is summarizing the procedures for doing very simple connections of chords, moving from one chord to another using a standard four-part writing format. I'm following the guidelines that are in Chapter 1 of Miguel Roig-Francoli's book, Harmony in Context, but I'll be putting a somewhat different emphasis, and I think that if you take careful notes on these three lectures, you'll find that the approach to the connection of chords is fairly easy. Let's start by talking about the kind of choir that we're writing for. We're writing for a mixed choir, sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses. And as you've already seen in class, the way that we distinguish between the women's voices, which are both in treble clef, is that we have the soprano stems going up and the alto stems going down. And that way we can keep two separate strands of music going on the same staff. By the same token, in the bass and the tenor parts, although they're both using bass clef, they will have stems going up for the tenor line, stems going down for the bass line. Many of the rules that we observe as far as how we write for our little choir is based on the idea that our lines should be singable and it should be easy for a small group of singers to get from one pitch to the next without having to have perfect pitch or anything like that. The other thing that you should know about our little choir is that it's not a great choir. It's not the Ball State Chamber Choir. So this is an amateur choir. It's maybe a church choir. It's maybe an advanced high school choir, maybe a sort of secondary or tertiary college choir. So we need to work with somewhat limited vocal ranges of the singers to make sure that they can produce good tone. And we also have to be careful about the sorts of lines that we write for them. Let me show you the vocal ranges as explained in the Roig-Francoli textbook. Okay. So the sopranos will go from middle C up a 12th to the high G. Essentially, the sopranos will always be on the treble staff, although they can go as low as middle C. The altos range is also a span of a perfect 12th, but their lowest note is G, and their highest note is D. So their range is a perfect fourth lower than that of the sopranos. The tenors, likewise, will have a range of a perfect 12th, and their range is an octave lower than the sopranos. They will go from C3 up to G4. Now, notice that the tenor is going to be singing often up above the bass staff on ledger lines, and that's very typical. Don't worry about writing for the tenors a little bit above the bass staff. Tenors like to do that. It makes them feel like tenors. They love to hit those high notes. So go ahead and write high notes for them. The bass may be a little harder to remember. The bass range is a little bit broader than the others. It's a 13th rather than a 12th. Their high note is middle C, which is the same as the lowest note of the sopranos. And then it goes down to the E below the staff. So learn to keep your four vocal parts within that range. And if you don't, I will call you on it. Eventually, as we go through the first few chapters of the book, the first few numbered chapters of the book, we will be adding first inversion and second inversion triads to the mix. But in the beginning, we'll be mostly focusing on root position triads. There's a little bit in Chapter 1 that deals with triads other than root position ones, but it's really mostly sort of introductory. And really, you should be focusing in Chapter 1 on what do you do when you're moving from one root position triad to the next root position triad. Mr. Roig-Francoli makes the point in Chapter 1 that different doublings are possible. One can, if you have four voices and if you have three notes of a triad, one note of the triad is going to be doubled. Sometimes it works best to double the root. Sometimes it works just as well to double the fifth, and occasionally it works best to double the third of the chord. And in chapter 1, he gives examples of all of these. My recommendation, and really I'm going to enforce this on you, so it's more than a recommendation. I'm going to have you in this class, when you write root position triads, for the time being, I'm going to have you always double the root. So the top 3 voices, soprano, alto, and tenor, will have a complete triad, and then the bass will also have a root. So the bass plus one of these upper voices will have the root of the chord. The bass note, i.e. the root of the chord, will be doubled in the root position triads. Something that you need to be particularly careful about as you go on is that you don't double any tendency tones. The strong tendency tones, as you probably know, are, first of all, the most important one is the leading tone. You should never have 2 leading tones in a chord, because both of those leading tones really want to go to tonic, and when they both go to tonic, they will have parallel octaves or parallel unisons. Or if you have only one of them going to tonic, the other one will be frustrated because it won't be able to go to tonic. So do not double the leading tone. In your 5 chord in particularly, we'll be writing a lot of 5 chords. Always include the leading tone once, but don't put 2 leading tones in. Other tendency tones to avoid doubling. In minor, you should avoid doubling lay, the 6th scale degree. When we get into 7th chords, you must not double the 7th of the chord. Those are the main tendency tones that we'll be dealing with in this semester. We're going to use 2 different types of spacing in this class. As we go on and as we get into chords in inversion and we start to use different doublings, you'll find that there are more ways of writing an individual chord. But for now, confine yourself to close position and open position as I am about to define them. A chord that is in close position, as the name suggests, has the 3 upper voices very close to each other. So let's take that D minor triad that we were doing before, and I will put an A in the soprano. Okay, below the A, I will put the next chord tone, which is as close to the A as possible. The next chord tone down is the F. Now for the tenor, I will put the next chord tone as close to the F as possible. And the note that is right below the F is D, and it's D4. It's the D above middle C. So don't make the mistake of writing the D down here. That'll open up a big gap in the middle of your chord. We'll write the D on one ledger line for the tenor like this. The exception to the close spacing is the distance between the bass and the tenor. Often the distance between the bass and the tenor even exceeds an octave, and that's okay, although it wouldn't be okay to have that kind of a space between the tenor and the alto, or the alto and the soprano. So I have my complete triad, D, F, A, here, and the bass is going to then have another D, and that's a close position chord. If I had an F in the soprano, then I could have the D right below it. The next chord tone below D is A. Again, we'll check, do we have a complete triad in the upper voices? Yes, we do. And here's the bass on the D. Notice that the soprano can't be really at the top of her range when you're writing a close position chord. Let's see what would happen if I tried to put a high F in the soprano. Okay, that's within the soprano's range. And the next chord tone below this F is D. And that's still within the alto's range. But the next chord tone below the D is A, A4. So that would necessitate putting a note up here above the 3rd ledger line, and that's a step higher than you want your tenors to sing. So this won't work. We could, however, put a D in the soprano. The next chord tone down is A. Below that is F, and again, be sure that you write the pitch F, which is right below this A. It has to be F4, the F above middle C. That means writing it up on ledger lines. And then the D is in the bass again. Okay, so to summarize close position, you're going to have a complete triad in the soprano, alto, and tenor in the upper voices. And you're going to have intervals of thirds, major or minor thirds, and possibly a fourth, generally a perfect fourth, between the soprano and alto, and between the alto and the tenor. It kind of depends on what note the soprano has. Here with the soprano on the chordal fifth, we have a third below that, and then between the alto and the tenor, there's a third. Here with the soprano on F, we have a third below the F, but the distance from the tenor to the alto is a perfect fourth. And in this chord, the perfect fourth is between the soprano and the alto, with the alto and the tenor being a third apart. Next, let me show you open position. I'm going to write some D minor triads now in open position. Open position means that we open up more of a space between the adjacent voices. Essentially, between the soprano and the alto, there will be space to put one more chord tone. Between the alto and the tenor, there will be a space to put one more chord tone. So here's what open position looks like. For this one, I'll start on the high D. I go down, I find the next chord tone, and I don't put the alto on that note, but I remember that note. And then I go down to the next chord tone below that, and I give that note to the alto. So that's what I mean by opening up a space for a single chord tone. Between the F and the D, there's room for one more note of the D minor triad, namely the A. The tenor is going to have an A. It won't be this A, but it'll be the A an octave lower. And then I'll put the bass on the D. If I have the soprano on the F, the next chord tone below F is a D, so I'm going to pay attention to that, but I'm not going to put the alto there. Instead, the alto will be near the bottom of her range on the A. The D will be an octave lower in the tenor. Okay. Notice how between the F and the A, there's room for one more chord tone. We could put a D in between those two notes. And here between the A and the D, there's room for one more chord tone. We could have put an F there, but we're not going to. Now with the tenor this low, the tenor and the bass are going to have to be on the same note, and that's okay. It's fine for there to be a unison. We show the unison by showing a single note head with both an upward and a downward pointing stem. Over here on the right, I've written a summary of what I've just shown you. In close position, you will have a complete triad in the upper three voices, thirds and fourths between the soprano and the alto, between the alto and the tenor, maybe a larger interval between the tenor and the bass. Open position, again, we're going to have a complete triad in the three upper voices. Notice that I've got a D, an F, an A in the first chord. In the second chord, I have the tenor on a D, the soprano on an F, the alto on an A. Again, a complete triad in those three upper voices. In open position, the intervals between the soprano and the alto and between the alto and the tenor are sixths and sometimes a fifth, usually a perfect fifth. So here there's a sixth from D to F, a sixth between F and A. Here there's a sixth between F and A, a fifth between A and D. And I've added the note that the tenor and the bass can be a unison. There are two spacing errors that you should avoid. If you follow my instructions for how to build a close position or how to build an open position chord, you won't commit either one of these errors. Mistake number one is having a gap larger than an octave between the soprano and the alto, or between the alto and the tenor. If you have a gap bigger than an octave between the tenor and the bass, that's okay. Okay, so see up here, I've put my F way, way, way at the top of the staff, and then I've put the alto more than an octave below that. So that opens up this space of more than an octave. Okay, the way to fix that is either to leave this F where it is and use open position to fill in the inner voices, or if you are allowed to change the soprano, if this wasn't a note that was given to you, you can move it down an octave and have a nice close position chord, F4, D4, and A3, much closer together. Here's a spacing error that probably many of you will make because most of you are not used to writing in treble and bass clef at the same time or thinking in treble and bass clef at the same time. It's kind of obvious here that there's a big gap, but it's less obvious here because the gap is between the alto, which is on A4, and the tenor, which is on F3. So between these notes, there's a gap greater than an octave. And the way to fix that, again, is to either use open position, which means changing which voice has the F and which has the A. You could put the F in the alto and the A in the tenor. Okay, the other possibility is to keep the D and the A where they are, but then have the tenor not on F3, but on F4 up on a few ledger lines. And again, it's perfectly fine to have a chord like this. Here we have more than an octave between the tenor and the bass. And that is okay. That is not a spacing error. The other type of spacing error that you can have, which is less common, is to have a voice crossing. A voice crossing is something that you have within a single chord, and it means that instead of the voices going from top to bottom, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, somewhere the low voice is above the voice that ought to be higher than it. The most common type of voice crossing would probably be between the tenor and the alto. Here I'm trying to write a close position chord, but I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing. So I write an A in the soprano, and then I write a D that's too far below that, but I still know that I need to have a complete triad in the upper voices, so I put the F in the tenor. So here you can see that the alto is on D4 and the tenor is on F4. In other words, the tenor is above the alto. So that's a case of voice crossing. Don't do that. Also avoid doing something like this, where the soprano is below the alto. And of course, avoid doing anything like this, where the tenor is below the bass. So avoid voice crossings. That'll get you started writing single chords using correct spacing and doubling. More on chapter 1 coming up.